I decided to go even further back after understanding that Ansel Keys was using a lot of his data from a guy called Leland Orber, who'd gone to Crete in 1948 with the Rockefeller Foundation. They had wanted to see what was happening in this war-torn country. He was recording rationing, post-war rationing. He named sugar, he named wheat flour and said half of it was imported. He named rice and said all of it was fully imported in their diet. The Mediterranean basin is huge. The Mediterranean Sea, it's bordered by 22 states that border or sit within it, and people who live on the coast are more likely to access fish and seafood. People who live inland and in the mountainous areas rely on pastoralism and tend to eat a higher animal produce diet. When Ansel Keys came back in 1957, he said that Cretans had the lowest rate of cardiovascular disease, and he believed that was because 37% of their diet was olive oil. We've got a woman here who's very high profile in promoting and researching the Mediterranean diet, Catherine Itsiopoulos. She is, of course, on the advisory board for the olive oil wellness industry here, but this is where they're moving people towards this idea that olive oil is sanctified, it's the Holy Grail, and meat's bad.
Many people out there believe the Mediterranean diet is the healthiest way to eat. Where did this idea come from?
Where did this idea come from? I've gone right back in history, Jesse. I've got a funny story. I'll share this really quickly with you. I have been speaking about the blue zones, as you know, and I had a guy here in Australia, Dr. Peter Bruckner, come to one of my talks last year, and he is an exercise sports physician, and he was the team doctor for the Australian cricket team. He's been very high profile here in trying to advocate for low carbohydrate, healthy fat principles, reducing sugar, ever since he worked it out when he was the team doctor. And so after seeing my talk, he asked me if I'd come onto a Facebook live stream and talk about the blue zones. And I said, oh yes, I'd love to do that. And then about 2 weeks out, all of a sudden the advertising started saying I was talking about the Mediterranean diet and had olive oil and all these things. Like, far out. I haven't actually done a big study on the Mediterranean diet. I had 2 weeks. And I think because Nina Teicholz, Gary Taubes, Zoe Harcum have done such an amazing job pulling apart so many elements of Ansel Keys's work, and Zoe Harcum with the 22 countries, which became the 7 countries study for Ansel Keys, and an understanding that cholesterol is vital to our body, her work's just beautiful. And I mean, oh my gosh, I don't want to go down that same pathway that everyone else has spoken about. I want to really look to see what I can value add to this talk and do it sort of in a similar way that I've done with my Blue Zones research. So as Winston Churchill says, the farther back you look, the farther forward you can see. So I decided to go even further back after understanding that Ansel Keys was using a lot of his data from a guy called Leland Orber, who'd gone to Crete in 1948 with the Rockefeller Foundation. They had wanted to see what was happening in this war-torn country. And so, as I say, I just did this big deep dive and tried to understand so many things. As you know, the Mediterranean basin is huge. The Mediterranean Sea, it's bordered by 22 states that border or sit within it. And I think most people would understand, this is Southern Europe, Western Asia, Northern Africa, very, very different places. And people who live on the coast are more likely to access fish and seafood. People who live inland and in the mountainous areas rely on pastoralism and tend to eat a higher animal produce diet. And then, interestingly, Jesse, religion plays a huge part in the Mediterranean diet that we understand. Because if you think about it, half of the countries bordering the Mediterranean identify as Muslim. So Islam and Judaism, which is Israel is also there, they prohibit pork. And yet all of the Christian nations, the other half, use it as a dietary staple. So we have that real disconnect right from the outset of banning pork and eating it as a dietary staple. Catholicism covers about 7 of the countries, And as I mentioned previously with my Blue Zones talk, with Catholicism, that's avoiding warm-blooded animals. So they're allowed to eat fish and shellfish in religious fasting. It isn't as strict as Greek Orthodox, which covers Greece, Montenegro, and Cyprus. And within those countries, they're not allowed to eat red-blooded animals. And, well, it's probably worth mentioning it again in case people don't watch the first one, that red-blooded animals have hemoglobin in them, an iron-based protein that allows transportation of oxygen in vertebrates. But in religious fasting in Greek Orthodox ideology, they were allowed to eat bloodless animals. And back when the canons were written, bloodless animals were actually anything that had blue blood, which we've now discovered, and that's hemocyanin. So it's a copper-based protein, and that allowed them to eat shellfish, squid, octopi, mussels, and snails. So it wasn't no meat, even though we've often been told they're plant-based and it's pretty much a vegan diet when they're fasting. Looking from the outside in, I mean, of course you're going to believe it. I've got no idea until I started really looking and understanding it. So for 120 to 180 days a year, people in Ikaria, in the Blue Zone, and people in Crete, which is the global epicenter of the Mediterranean diet, they fast from red-blooded animals, but they can still eat shellfish, squid, octopi, mussels, and snails. And snails were so important in Crete, like in Ikaria, because a lot of the time, especially during the war, World War II, these people were pushed inland. And so snails were really all they could rely on as their protein to be able to eat, apart from plant-based protein. So it was a really, really important part of their diet for that fasting. But after fasting, there's always feasting. And that's what a lot of the information that we hear over and over, we don't find out about. We don't understand that all of these things, pigs, goats, sheep, the milk, the cheeses, not so much the milk, sorry, the cheeses, the yogurt, all of those things come back onto the table. So where did we get this messaging from? I think Leland Orber is a really interesting place to go back to, because when he went to do his study in 1948, when he went to look at Crete to see how it was recovering from war, and I'll just mention something like, there's different numbers, but anything between 6 and 25,000 civilians were killed in Crete. And this was due to war, due to executions, due to starvation, which was a big way the Nazis took over, and they either pilfered their animals or they slaughtered them. They decimated crops or they requisitioned them. And these people were pretty much starving. So when he came in 1948, when Leland Orber came, he was recording rationing, post-war rationing. He named sugar, he named wheat flour and said half of it was imported. He named rice and said all of it was fully imported in their diet. And when he spoke to people, some of them had a goat, but this goat often lived in the house with them for protection. And he mentioned that livestock numbers were up to 30% below pre-war levels, and swine and poultry in particular, because they often feed on kitchen scraps, their numbers were sharply reduced, severely, sharply reduced, because there wasn't food for them. And so we're looking at a time, a place in time that was affected by religious ideology and fasting, and also by a lack of food post-war. And going on through some of his other things that he was saying, he said that 1 in 6 families said that they didn't have enough food. One family in particular stated that they were hungry all of the time. And then this data, which was published in 1953, was referred back to by Ancel Keys. So it confuses the messaging even more. And then when Ancel Keys did his study I think he had a sabbatical in 1951 to 52, and he visited Italy and Spain and Crete to look to see what was happening with people. He was really wanting his cholesterol hypothesis to take off, his idea that saturated fat was causing heart disease. And so if he went there then only a few years after Leland Orber had visited in this post-war period. So I can't imagine in 3 years it's improved dramatically. There's no electricity on Crete in any of the villages at that point in time. And the transport, a lot of the roads had been bombed. And so it was a very difficult life at this point. And then he came back, I think, in the 1957 and visited Crete 6 times then. So we're talking 10 years later. But Leland Orber had also noted in his publication that came out in 1953, he'd also noted that the average age of death was 48 in Crete in 1948. So we're talking about a lot of people had died. He sometimes talked about visiting generational homes, but the generational home might have only had 3 people in it. So it could have been a child, a mother, and a grandmother for all we know. How many men, how many physically capable men or how many elderly men had been killed and women and children in that time. So the average age of death was 48 and average life expectancy was 55 or 56. Compared to America, the average age of death, I think, was 58 or 59 and the average life expectancy was 67. So it wasn't as good as America, and yet here it was being held up as this model diet. When Ancel Keys came back in 1957, he said that Cretans had the lowest rate of cardiovascular disease. And he believed that was because 37% of their diet was olive oil. But that's 10 years. How old were the people that he was studying? Were they elderly? Or had these people, and a lot of people died post-war. So those numbers weren't even included. As I said before, they might have died from dysentery. They died from wound infections that don't count as the actual war period, but affected them afterwards. And malaria and TB were also a big impact on health. In Greece, in particular on the mainland, hundreds of thousands of people died from post-war complications. So it just makes me wonder. And then it was noted by a couple of investigators who one of them had actually spoken to someone who was part of Ancel Keys' original investigation, and they acknowledged 60% of people were fasting for Lent from his dietary survey that he actually conducted.
Coming back to the top of this story, Leland, 1948.
Yes.
What was his initial goal of going there? What inspired that?
Okay, that's really interesting. Okay, so we're going to jump back a little bit more and think about the fact that since ancient times, powerful civilizations have tried to capture trade and transport routes within the Mediterranean basin. It was a very, very powerful place. And Crete in particular, it was occupied by empires, rebels, saints and conquerors. And in 1869, the Suez Canal opened up. And in 1940, that's why Hitler wanted it. He wanted to come in and have access to that Suez Canal. I wonder if Rockefeller started sending Leland Orber and other people to do malarial control after the First World War. So he started sending people in the 1930s to try to modernize and eradicate malaria. But they sent people in to restructure a lot of these third world countries or countries that had been badly damaged by war. And then there was a debt. And then that debt enabled them to have access to places. Now, that's a theory. I'm wondering if part of that was due to it. But by sending Leland Orber into Crete, they wanted to work out how to modernize it. They wanted to give this report back to Greece, to the government, the administration there, to work out how they could improve the road structures, how they could improve electricity, how they could improve food production. And so it was an undernourished area that needed modernization. That's what Leland Orber's takeaway was from this. So I'm still trying to research and do more information on that, but that's where I think it's coming from, Jesse.
Okay. So Leland went in first.
Hmm.
Shortly after, Keyes comes in.
Yes.
Did the two of them work together at all?
No, I don't believe they ever worked together. But Keyes accessed a lot of this information and used data from Leland Orber's report within his research that he published later on. It was part of the referencing. So then I've got to... Now we jump all the way forward and we look at a woman called Antigone Kouros Blazos, and she worked with Antonia Trikolopoulou, who Nina Teicholz has talked about quite a lot, working with Walter Willett and Greg Drescher in designing the Mediterranean diet with, up into the 1990s and this health halo that they put around it. But Antonia worked with Antigone Kouros Blazos and Mark Walquist. Now, here is a neatly tied package. Mark Walquist was the expert witness on Gary's case here in Australia. So they were designing the Mediterranean Diet Score, which has been used by about 90% of Mediterranean diet research ever since. They were designing the score in the 1990s. And this concept, they were looking back at Ansel Keys's food dietary questionnaire, reinterpreting it 30 years later in the 1990s, published in the 1995, and not acknowledging religious ideology, the fasting, not acknowledging that he was looking at people during Lent, not acknowledging that it was really still post-war that he was going and examining these people. And then they created this Mediterranean diet score, Jessie, and when you go through it, it's got 8 pieces for the scorecard. And they talk about the 8 elements of the scorecard as how much meat, obviously, how much saturated fat, how much olive oil, how much legumes, and even they include wine within this scorecard. But they mentioned in their documentation, in their actual published research, not in the fine print, but you have to go digging to say that only 40% of people that they studied in the 1990s for this part of this paper, so they'd done the med score and then they worked on it to see if it actually correlated and worked, and only 40% of elderly Greeks, less, so it wasn't even that, 40% of elderly Greeks didn't even reach statistical significance of eating their so-called traditional diet. They only qualified for 3 or less of these 8 on the scorecard. And then they never tell whether that was because they ate meat or they ate animal fats. Doesn't talk about whether it was because of wine. Doesn't actually say what that part was. But this research and this Mediterranean diet score has been used by 90% of the Mediterranean diet research ever since. And that just blows my mind. Also, they acknowledged within this publication that fish and olive oil did not achieve significant statistical significance, and it was legumes that apparently appeared to be the thing that was contributing to health and longevity. So here we've got this paper, and yet somehow olive oil has become sanctified. It's become this amazing thing, and it didn't even achieve statistical significance within their paper in 1995.
I want to come back to this idea. You mentioned 22 countries, part of the Mediterranean.
Yes.
We've been focused on Greece. How do they become tied in? And how much research has been done outside of Greece?
Crete became the diet. A bit like Loma Linda when I've discussed the blue zones. And we've gone through all the blue zones, and then suddenly they take away what was being eaten in all of these traditional places or all of these ancestral communities and just focus in on Loma Linda. And that becomes the health halo of the blue zones. That becomes the diet. The plant-based diet comes from Loma Linda. None of the others were plant-based. They ate plants, but it wasn't a plant-based diet. I believe from the 7 countries study, it really suited Ansel Keys's hypothesis to say that animal protein and fat was bad, or particularly animal fat at the time. Cholesterol was causing heart disease. And so by using Crete, where they had such strict fasting practices, he was able to go there and see a lot of people who did not eat any animal protein or fat. Because remember, it's red blood, so it's not even fish. It's a very strict diet during that time, but once the fasting is over, then there's feasting. So I think it was held up as the diet because it suited. So he went to other countries for sure, 22 countries originally, and then dropped it because they weren't apparently suiting the hypothesis. But he narrowed it down to 7. But I still believe, just like the Blue Zones, that he cherry-picked the bits that he wanted out of places, and Crete became the model diet. And this is where all of the Mediterranean diet refers back to Crete, Crete, Crete.
Do we know where Keyes initially came up with the hypothesis and what his motivation was behind that?
As I say, I haven't done a huge amount of research into Ansel Keys because so many other people have. I believe there were 2 factions debating, I guess, the heart disease in the 1960s. So Professor John Yudkin was at the Queen Elizabeth College in London, and he believed refined sugar and high fructose corn syrup was the culprit. Whereas in America, Ansel Keys was arguing about the cholesterol hypothesis. He was defending it hugely. Now, I think we spoke a little bit about the idea that for food industry, which was in particular Fred Stair's Harvard School of Public Health, was being bankrolled by Kellogg's and the food industry and canning, tin canning. His father actually owned the Continental Canning Company, I believe, and Harvard owned millions of shares in the company. So we're talking about an idea that if you blame saturated fat for harm, then you can minimize the harms of sugar. And this idea, I believe, came through funding and came about because he had this idea. He'd done a lot of starvation diets. And I guess when you put people on these starvation diets, they weren't eating saturated fat. They weren't eating animal fat. They weren't eating a lot of protein. They weren't eating a lot of anything. And so his starvation diet sort of moved across to this. But I truly believe there was a lot of funding in this space to minimize the harms of sugar and make animal fats the scapegoat. And if you look at John Yudkin, he asked to take some time off, or he actually resigned from his position, but he had a conversation with the college about keeping his area to keep doing some research because he wanted to write his book, Pure, White and Deadly. And that was in 1971. But they reneged, and instead they employed someone who had a devout belief in Ansel Keys's cholesterol hypothesis. And so he was inserted into this position, and John Yudkin lost any use of the space. But it was really, really bad news for Australia. And the reason was Stuart Truswell was trying really hard to pass on, in his exact words, pass on his enthusiasm to the establishment in Britain, but apparently they weren't moved. So he gave up trying to insert this cholesterol hypothesis in Britain, and he came to Australia and he set up he was the foundational chair of nutrition at the Sydney University here, and he was the one in 1979 who introduced the same dietary guidelines, dietary goals that you guys had introduced in 1977. He introduced them here in 1979. So Australia also completely embraced this idea that saturated fat was bad and sugar didn't really matter, because Sydney University has been called out over and over for their potential conflicts of interest with industry in minimising the harms of sugar. And so it's the same thing. And that's Ansel Keys's hypothesis that's come through. But as for a lot of information, you'd really need to talk to Nina and Zoe, because I've tried to create a different story and work around it that would suit, I guess, the research that I've been doing and bring a different conversation to the table.
Okay, so we've talked about Leland, we've talked about Keys, their work going all the way back to the 40s and 50s. We touched on the 90s. Let's come full circle and talk about Mediterranean diet today.
The Mediterranean diet today, I believe in some cases, the Mediterranean diet has been called out by so many people that there is becoming a little bit of hesitancy within that space. And I've seen the Blue Zones diet starting to be used by spokespeople for the Dietitians Australia here, and no doubt it's getting very big in America. But lifestyle medicine, which I spoke about in our last talk, the American College of Lifestyle Medicine was founded on the Loma Linda University campus in 2003 as the Christian Association of Lifestyle Medicine. Now, lifestyle medicine has its roots in Adventism. I think I talked about the fact that they merged with Coca-Cola, which didn't really make a lot of sense to me at the time, and they've gotten a lot of food and even they started to work with pharmaceutical. But I guess if you think about it, a plant-based diet, like a plate that's completely devoid of any animal protein or fat, is going to have to be supplemented. People actually can't, over time, be cured, Jessie. Yes, if you go onto a vegan diet and you've been eating a high-processed, highly refined diet that has a lot of sugar and carbs in it, and you move towards a whole food vegan diet, you can improve your health dramatically, and you'll see those results very quickly. But over time, your body starts to become depleted of essential nutrients. And unless you keep supplementing and fortifying, and as I mentioned before, in the fine print of the Adventist Health Studies, they quantify vegetarians as eating meat, eggs, milk, cheeses. They can eat it once a week and still be a vegetarian, and they can be a vegan. In their food studies, they can be said to be vegan and still eating all of those things once a month, which isn't what the public would understand as being a vegan diet. But their plates do not show anything. There's not a single animal protein or fat on there. And I've been looking into lifestyle medicine. And here in Australia, they've tried to disentangle themselves a little bit, because obviously I've been speaking out about it since 2017 publicly, and questioning the foundations of it. They've got sister organisations around the world. And in 2018, 2019, probably even 2020, these sister organisations were still running all of their course content and all of their examinations through the American College of Lifestyle Medicine or the International Board of Lifestyle Medicine under the American umbrella. And so as I started to say to people here, yes, you might be saying you're not a devout Seventh-day Adventist group here in Australia, but if you're doing all your work through that, you're educating people here on this belief that animal proteins and fats are bad because of a religious ideology, not because of anything else. So interestingly, in going into this Mediterranean, we've got a woman here who's very high profile in promoting and researching the Mediterranean diet. And her work, Catherine Itsiopoulos, she is, of course, on the advisory board for the olive oil wellness industry here. And I think that's what Nina has called out over and over again with her work when she's been looking at people in the 1990s. You know, they've been on sponsored trips, and even journalists who came along were sponsored by the olive oil industry because that's what they wanted to highlight, despite Antigone Kouros-Blazos saying maybe it wasn't significant statistically. So Catherine Itsiopoulos is definitely olive oil, and anti-animal proteins and fats. She did a study in 2024, which Nina also referenced, and their study said that low carbohydrate diets caused diabetes. And she's also on the board of the Australasian Society of Lifestyle Medicine here. So this is the tie between lifestyle medicine and their belief, their purpose, I believe. The underlying foundational mission is to demonize animal protein and fat. They might say, a little bit of meat if it's lean is okay, but this is where they're moving people towards this idea that olive oil is sanctified, it's the Holy Grail, and meat's bad. Her study saying that low-carb diets cause diabetes, when you look at it, she was saying that a low-carb diet was 187 grams of carbs per day or more. And in our world, there's no way. Like, a low-carb diet is at least under 120, if not under 50, if not under 30 for people who are quite serious about going very low carb. And so that makes no sense. Her diet wasn't low carb at all. So it was conflicting. But she is on the board of a newly formed Mediterranean Lifestyle Medicine Institute. So they've started a brand new one, Jessie. And this Mediterranean Lifestyle Medicine Institute's mission, when it was developed a couple of years ago, it was 2023, I think, it just reminded me of Nina's work. And here we had, postcard pictures of beautiful Aegean waters and, dancing and plant-based foods and all sorts of things happening. It was invitation only, and they were there to redefine the Mediterranean diet, to bring it under the umbrella of lifestyle medicine. It's like, what? Anyway, I started to look more and more into this, and I believe that lifestyle medicine as a whole, because there's been a lot of calling out. So the American College of Lifestyle Medicine is still very prominent in America. It's got a lot of influence around the world in these global sister organizations. A lot of them, quite a few of them, I should say, have been started by devout Seventh-day Adventists. Others have either people who are Seventh-day Adventists or plant-based because of ethical reasons or potentially financial reasons. Like, there's a whole range of things why people are promoting it. I'm not saying people are bad, it's just this is what it is. And when you look at the Australian one, because we're such a secular community here, they wanted to push away this idea that it's come from religion. And so the World Lifestyle Medicine Organization was formed a few years ago, but it came from the International Board of Lifestyle Medicine. It came from other things. It's just been renamed, and suddenly it's the World Lifestyle Medicine Organization, and the American College of Lifestyle Medicine isn't on it. But the World Lifestyle Medicine Organization events that happen with the countries that are signed up to it still highlight people from the American College of Lifestyle Medicine in their events. So they're still there. It's just the name's been taken away, I believe, so that the Australasian Society of Lifestyle Medicine can tell me they're not there anymore. We're not part of it. But this Mediterranean Lifestyle Medicine Institute, I think they're wanting to go there for the British and the Australasian Society and a couple of the other societies that really want to distance themselves from the Adventist ideology but have complete belief in the idea of olive oil being sanctified. So this redefining is really lifestyle medicine wanting cultural legitimacy. Because if they can convince people that a cretin diet, especially during fasting, is completely vegan, so they're not eating very much animal protein at all or animal fats, it's minimal. You think, but no, this is nuanced. What religion would tell their members that they can't have nutrition, that they can't be nourished, even though they have to observe this long period of fasting, they're still allowed to nourish themselves. It's just in a different package. And yet the Mediterranean Lifestyle Medicine Institute they have published that Greek Orthodox fasting is completely vegan. It's just wrapping it all up into everything, Jessie. It's the blue zones. And again, the blue zones, the American College of Lifestyle Medicine is credentialing blue zone doctors. The Mediterranean Lifestyle Medicine Institute is talking about the blue zones because they're pulling in your car. It's just like, it is just so circular and so powerful. And if people don't understand where this is coming from, it's very hard to question it. And I just keep diving deeper. Why are we told this messaging over and over again?
In your mind, again, there is so many connections and circles here. How much of it at the root comes back to the Adventists?
A lot of it comes back to the Seventh-day Adventist Church's beliefs, to their ideology. And you've got to remember that medical evangelism, Ellen G. White, taught right at the very beginning that medical evangelism is the right arm of the church, and the health reform message which she taught, fruits, grains, nuts and seeds, that Adam ate in his sinless state, we're to eat because it's the God-appointed diet for man to go back to a sinless state before they can be translated to heaven. So she wrote before translation, meat eating has to be given up. She talked about flesh meat being evil. She talked about flesh meat defiling not only men, women and children, but physically, morally and spiritually. And there's a guy called Ruben Sanchez Sabat, and he wrote a research paper, I think in 2015, but I might be wrong with the dates, might have been 2005. And his paper was talking about the use of food in Seventh-day Adventism and the use of it by Ellen G. White. And it wasn't just nourishment that she was talking about or salvation, but she was using it as, I guess, an identity and a tool for evangelism. And they've mentioned over and over, and I've got screen grabs where they say their health reform message could be taken into places where they cannot take a Bible. You know, they can go into China with healthcare and then use healthcare as their evangelistic mission, I guess. Total member involvement. Every single person in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and there's 23.5 million people on the books. But again, there was a guy recently who was speaking, and he said while that number of people are on the books, at least 1/3 of them never go to church. So how many are really part of the church? Have they just not bothered taking their names off? I don't know. But that was an interesting talk. I only heard it last week. So it's a small group, but they're very powerful, and they are determined to take this message as far as they can. As I've mentioned before, education, healthcare, food industry, these are all part of the commercial church in ensuring their message goes further. And dietetics has been a huge part of it as well. And I think when I've looked back at the American Dietetics Association, it was founded in 1917 by a woman called Lena Frances Cooper. And she, I think I talked about it in our last one, that she was John Harvey Kellogg's protege. So she was trained originally in home economics. Ella Eaton Kellogg, she married John Harvey Kellogg. Again, she was one of the first women to go to university and get a degree. And this was in home economics. And if you think about it back in the 1800s, Jessie, home economics was about structuring the home economically. It wasn't what we learn today in home economics, which is cooking food or learning that plant-based diets are good for us. This was really about the economics of running a home. And so when you think then when Ella Eaton Kellogg married John Harvey Kellogg, and he had this devout belief that he had to create foods to take the place of flesh meat, eggs, milk and butter, he had to invent and patent foods. And he offered the church twice over a number of years all of the profits from his inventions. And Ellen G. White said, no, we don't want them. But then she started her own, and he very kindly gifted his recipes to the church. So they had a head start. And then other people came through, like Harry Miller, and invented infant soy formula. And there's been many people who've taken up the mantle. But Ella and John Harvey Kellogg and William Keith Kellogg had a kitchen at the Battle Creek Sanitarium. Right from the outset, when she married him, she said, we need to learn how to cook. You want all of these really bland foods to be served. Well, people aren't going to eat them. So how do we make them more tasty? How do I improve the flavour? So home economics started to move into how can we make things palatable? How can we make things enjoyable? And that's where they started flaking wheat and making nut meat analogues and different things. I believe it was a lot of input from his wife, which makes sense. And then she was training Lena Cooper. Lena Cooper also was trained in nursing under a woman called Kate Lindsay, who's also a very devout Adventist. at the Battle Creek Sanitarium. She was a doctor, but she was training nurses. And so Lena had this very impressionable educational experience and was mentored by people who had a devout belief that flesh, meat, milk, eggs and butter were harmful to people. I have never been able to 100% determine whether she was a Seventh-day Adventist, but two of her brothers were missionaries for the church, so it would make sense that she was, and the church have claimed that she was, but from what I've read, I don't know. She might have been on the cusp. I don't know that she was ever baptized into the church, but she certainly believed it. She went into this space, into the American into the American Dietetics Association, into founding it with this belief. And I think I mentioned last time that the very first recipe book that she ever created was totally bound to John Harvey Kellogg's inventions. Every single recipe had some reference. You had to use his nuttos, his protos, this or that, the cereal coffees. I mean, this was the very first industry dietitian, as far as I'm concerned. And when they founded the American Dietetics Association in 1917, industry was there at the start. Now, I haven't done a huge double check on all that, but I think something like 8 industries were there. And they worked out right from the very outset, if they were going to have a professional, educated body of women talking about food, how important was it that the food industry was part of that conversation? How important it wasn't, and it wasn't just food industries either. It was refrigeration, it was ovens, it was anything that wanted to sell to women the importance of science in the kitchen. We're elevating it away from just mundane work. You're becoming scientists now. This is coming from a professional space. And it was a really interesting movement in this area. And while Lena Francis Cooper and another devout Seventh-day Adventist wrote the textbooks for dietetics for, I think, 30 years, they educated thousands of dietetic students in this belief that flesh, meat, milk, eggs and butter should be minimized. Lena actually had to go and work in another hospital and into another area so that she could understand how to learn different cuts of meat and learn how to create cheeses and different things, because it wasn't mainstream. And so she had to have a bit of knowledge of that. She went to Bellevue Hospital, I think, to learn those information. But when she came back, she was still trying to create within her dietetics education that they were minimized, if not completely removed. So then I think I talked to you in our last conversation about Mervyn Harding and his belief as part of so he wanted to do his doctoral studies on proving that vegetarianism was healthy. And he approached Fred Stair at the Harvard University. And so we've got Lena Cooper taking this information through. Then we've got, jumping back, the new Nutrition Science Laboratory under the Nutrition Institute. So they were specifically working on research to prove, not disprove, divine inspiration of Ellen G. White's work at the College of Medical Evangelists, which became Loma Linda University. And this messaging just kept going through, but by 1948, when Mervyn Harding went to work with Fred Stair, certainly by the 1950s, their research was starting to be published and picked up. Because as I mentioned, if you can prove that animal proteins and animal fats are bad, then you can minimize the harms of sugar. And it just suited everybody financially, for profit and protecting a profit. And this moved further into vegetarian position papers within the Dietetics Association. But you'll see on the very first position paper, the head of the American Dietetics Association at the time, I believe, was Kathleen Zolber, who was a devout Seventh-day Adventist. So she helped get these papers through. And if you look at every single signatory on that first paper, they were either devout Seventh-day Adventists or working for industry, or there was one person who had a very devout ethical belief in not eating animals. And yes, you need these people to be in there to help determine the best way for people not to eat animal proteins and fats if people choose to do that. But you can't have it stacked with these people so that people are being told this is the healthiest way to eat.
And do you feel like a lot of that messaging has translated through to dietetics today?
Absolutely. It just keeps coming through. So after I found the American Dietetics Association's vegetarian position papers, I looked here into Australia's, which has since been removed off their website. I kept it on the archive machine, which I talked about before as well. So if I find something that's really important, now I go into the Wayback Archive machine and I put that link in and I timestamp it so that it stays on the web. I didn't know how to do that at the beginning. I used to look up things, but now I've worked out to keep these things there for referenced links within my articles. I've worked out how to timestamp them, and I did save that one. But the position papers here in Australia, every single one of them was written by people who were devout Seventh-day Adventists and employed by the Seventh-day Adventist Church's food industry here, Sanitarium, or they were working for Kellogg's. And so again, Kellogg's was founded by devout Adventists, and I question whether William Keith remained an Adventist his entire life because he sent a lot of tithe to the church. He supported the church a lot with his industry, but the church never owned Kellogg's. They never owned the Kellogg's Food Company. And that's the distinction. They own 24 food industries, making over 2,500 foods at the moment. But Sanitarium here in Australia is very, very powerful. Even though the church has a small footprint, this food industry in particular supplies food to over 30 countries, and they make foods to take the place of flesh, meat, eggs, milk and butter. They have been involved in our dietary guidelines. They are involved in the Health Star rating system. It was one of the expert technical advisory people from Sanitarium who developed the algorithms for front-of-label packaging. They're involved now. The church has paid, Sanitarium has paid to be the educational resource for nutrition for a group called Life Education here in Australia. And Life Education has been educating children on drug and sexual health for decades. And now that Sanitarium has come in, parents, teachers, and children are just accepting this vegan, they say vegetarian, but if you look at all the resources, again, it's vegan promoting. The graphic makes the difference, doesn't it, Jessie? You might see something that looks, or you might hear it's vegetarian, but if you only see plants and no animal proteins or fats on a graphic, that's what you remember. And they are running this to every primary school child in Australia over the next couple of years, their educational resource. So it's big. It's really big. And I just think you sent me that beautiful video of a guy going to Crete to have a look at what they really eat. It doesn't make any sense that people don't eat. Self-sustaining communities need to eat animal proteins and fats. They need to eat what is locally and seasonally available, and they need to nourish themselves to survive. They need to resource themselves for the next generation. It makes no sense to be being told that we have to eat this unless we need to then rely on the processed food industry to fortify. We need to rely on the pharmaceutical industry to supplement, vitamin B12 in particular. It becomes very conflicted.
Well, there's just so many different ties as we keep talking about here.
Yes.
And it all comes back to the Adventists, at least most of it, because they're part of the blue zones, Loma Linda.
Yes.
And this is all part of the story as well. We went deep into it last time, but we need to at least high level talk about that piece again because it's connected to everything we're talking about here.
Yes.
Well, let's talk about the connection there with the church, Loma Linda, being a blue zone, and then the fact that they actually own the blue zones now.
Ah, yes.
So
okay,
there's no way they're getting kicked out of the pack.
There's no way. I know. And Dan Buttner in the last couple of years, Dan Buttner said, didn't really mean for Loma Linda to be there. So, but I've never bothered to take it away. But it's not a footnote. It is front and center because he has included it in his publications, he's included it in his documentaries. It was even in the Netflix documentary in 2023. There's no way it was a footnote. And as you say, the Seventh-day Adventist Church bought it in 2020. I believe Gary Fraser, who was one of the head or the lead investigators in the Adventist Health Studies, he appears to have been on the Blue Zones board ever since it began, of course, when Loma Linda was included. So we've got someone on the Adventist Health Studies who is on the board of the Blue Zones. He's there. Dan Buettner has also, of course, been on the board. But even since the church has bought the franchise, Dan Buettner is still there. Not only is he there, but his son is on the board as well. Both his brothers, Tony and Nick, speak on the Speakers Bureau for the Blue Zones. And this is not someone who's dropping Loma Linda anytime soon.
One of the Blue Zones is another Greek island, Icaria.
Yes.
And we talked about Crete. Again, so many similarities and parallels.
So many. And when you go through and you look at the different areas, so did you want me to talk just briefly over the Blue Zones quickly?
Yeah, let's bring that piece in again, high level, because it's important to fully understand what we've been discussing.
Okay, so high level. Michel Puller and Giovanni Pes, he was a physician researcher in Italy, and he uncovered and presented in 1999 to a longevity conference this area that he was looking at in Sardinia, about 800-900 meters above sea level, where he believed he'd found an exceptional group of isolated, they hadn't had Western food introduced to them. They were still living very simple lives. They were shepherding. They were raising their own food, hunting, gathering. It was seasonal. It was in rhythm, and it was resourcing the next generation, as I'm really passionate about. And he took this to the conference and said, maybe there's a genetic reason for this because they've been isolated for so long. Maybe they have some exceptional genetic variant that we could look at to see if we can replicate. Anyway, he was bagged out, apparently, at this conference. A lot of people poo-pooed him, and except for a guy called Michel Puller. He was a Belgian demographer. And he came across and he wanted to really look at this and get age validation. He wanted to do all sorts of things. But the more and more they looked into it, and I'll say it was the original Blue Zone because they were using a blue highlighter pen to circle this very small area in Sardinia, and the Blue Zone revealed itself. So they started to understand there didn't appear to be a genetic component. It really appeared that these people, it was the place they were in. It was a longevity area. They were longevity people. So they were doing some studies. It became the IKEA study. And similar time, studies were being done in Okinawa by Makoto Suzuki. And he was looking at the longevity of Okinawans, thinking, again, a genetic aberrant because these people have got incredible longevity. He went there in 1976, I believe, from Tokyo. And he just discovered, he was a gerontologist, and he discovered more and more people with exceptional longevity. And he was looking at their birth certificates or the kaseki, which is the birth certificates, marriage certificates, and death certificates handwritten in Japan at the time, and just was quite mind blown. So Dan Buettner had heard about this, and he pitched the quest to National Geographic in 2004 and said, can I go in search of the secrets of longevity, which is what the title of the front cover was in the National Geographic in 2005. So he included Okinawa and Sardinia, but he says that the editor said, well, this is great. We've got these people who are potentially the poorest and the least educated in their respective nations. They're living off the land. They are looking after themselves. They're spending a lot of time in the sun. How are we going to sell this to Americans? You need an American city. Obviously, the Adventist health studies were being published, and maybe he was aware of that. So it would have potentially tied in as to why Dan Buettner chose Loma Linda as the third blue zone in his investigation and in his National Geographic article. But Loma Linda is so different, Jessie, to those two, and also to Ikaria and Nicoya, which became the 5 blue zones over time, where again, these people learned how to prepare foods traditionally, preserve foods, nixtamalization, I worked it out from the last one, of corn. They had the wisdom passed down through generations. Loma Linda was an abandoned hotel originally, the Mound City Hotel. Mound City, 1,000 railway workers were living there while they were laying the railway tracks. There were 5.5 million orange trees under cultivation underneath that Mound City Hotel. But when the railway tracks were finished and the workers moved away, 2 lots of investors tried to do something with this incredibly large and grand and magnificent hotel. And I guess the hilltop dream faded until 1905, when Ellen G. White heard about it and told the church she had seen this exact place in visions a few years ago. This was what they had to purchase, and they got it at a bargain price because it had sat empty for years. And within months of moving in there, they had the sanitarium set up, they were training nurses. By 1909, they were training the College of Medical Evangelists, they were training doctors to be missionaries. She'd already set the school system up in 1906, and currently they state they've got about 1,300 students in that school, and 97% of the students will graduate and go to tertiary education. Even just that is such a disconnect between the other areas. The College of Medical Evangelists became Loma Linda University Medical Center. And if you look at that structure, it is stories high, a glass building. It just sits like a statue in the middle of the landscape. Nothing like that in any of the other blue zones. Certainly not the traditional blue zones, the ones that they're trying to recreate and sell to us as a longevity pill. So we're talking about the second biggest educator in the world, even though they've got that really small membership. Second biggest educator. They are also the second largest Protestant healthcare providers in the world. And I mentioned before, there's, I think about I won't say, there are 34 hospitals in Florida alone, but the healthcare system in America is massive under the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And yes, now they've bought the blue zones. The American College of Lifestyle Medicine is training doctors throughout America. Do you know, the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, did I talk about the White House conference on hunger, nutrition and health last time?
No, you didn't.
So the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, when they heard about this, they were saying, we would like to offer hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of resources to help this conference. We'll provide education resources for this many doctors and this many participants. But when I went back and had a look, their donation to the White House conference on hunger, nutrition and health was a very small portion of pre-created educational materials that were fairly, not say bland, they were nice, but they weren't strict about what their beliefs were. And they were offering it to these. So in effect, it didn't cost them anything. They just had to give the unlock key. They just had to give the link to how 200,000 doctors that they offered the free resource to. And my concern, and I spoke to Judy Cho about this in 2020, was that this idea meant they could potentially have the most incredible windfall, because all they needed was even say half of those doctors to say, maybe I'll try another educational resource and pay for it. Maybe I'll go to a conference. Maybe I'll become a member. Their windfall could be in the millions, Jessie. So it's like the blue zones. Now they're accrediting people, they're accrediting cities. So I think there are 75 cities currently accredited as blue zones, but the church owned that franchise. And in 2018, I found a document saying it was almost $7 million US for accreditation for that community. And then you've got to keep paying the accreditation fees. And I've read some people say that the metrics have been slightly confusing and tweaked to make it look better than it actually is. And the costs are quite prohibitive. I spoke to a guy in America that said they had Tony Butner, I believe, or maybe it was Nick, come and speak to them about potentially becoming a blue zone. And it cost them, I think, $20,000 just to have him come and talk before they even signed up for anything. And I just think the amount of money the church must be making from corporate wellness, wellness tourism, medical education, this belief, their healthcare reform message at this point in time is phenomenal. So if you consider that there are currently 36 patents pending since the church have bought it for more merchandise, for more food products, for, I think there's even a water, for real estate and for wellness tourism to still go through. Like their ability to commercialize these products has erased what their foundations were. The 7 countries, the 22 countries, the Mediterranean diet was not Crete's orthodox fasting diet. I explained to you, they're so different. 22 states border and sit within that space. This isn't a single diet, and the same with the blue zones. They're so diverse, and they rely on ancestral nourishment of animal foods and plant foods, preserved and fermented and cultured so that they are the healthiest, and I guess so that they can keep eating them. This isn't processed food that's made in a factory, which is what the Seventh-day Adventist Church sells.
To me, to get any value out of this Blue Zones thing, we need to remember there's a lot of money at the foundation and religion. But given that, to me, we have to parse out a couple of different things. One, are these people actually living the longest? And 2, if they are, what are they actually eating and doing? Because we've already in our last chat went deep into the fact that the 4 traditional blue zones all rely on pigs. So there's a lot of different pieces. That's just one of the pieces.
And it's a very important piece.
Right. But my point here is, let's take each of those pillars. Do we know if in any of the blue zones, these people are scientifically actually living longer?
In Sardinia, Michel Pula has published in 2024 an article showing a graph that the age validation of 40 Sardinians, and he said at the time when they did it, there was more, but he has shown that the age validation of these particular centenarians and super centenarians in Sardinia with very good, administration has shown that these people potentially were that age and had survived, but it doesn't talk about anyone who may have left. It doesn't talk about survivorship, how many people actually passed away. These may be incredibly healthy people that have survived. They live within a close family unit and they live as a very valued member. They still have purpose within their lives. They move. They're in rocky, mountainous regions. So to get from one house to another, they have to still be climbing hills. I think Sardinia potentially was an area. Is it still? No. They had this, what do they call it? Something like a nutrition transition. I think Giovanni Pes and Michel Pula specifically clarify this. Nutrition transition occurred in the lower areas of Italy and Sardinia in particular in about the 1970s. But it happened much later up in the mountains, just purely because of the way they were living and access to these places. It just happened a lot later. So was their longevity due to this later development of potentially having better medication? Maybe some, I couldn't call any industrial food good, but maybe they were starting to get some fortification, supplementation, and the lack of nursing homes, the lack of, people didn't go to hospital. They were looked after so much more. They went there for emergencies, but most people were tended and cared for at home. They weren't being told we need to medicate, operate, do all these things like America and Australia. And again, this nutrition transition was when a lot of this idea that medicating people, working out baselines. If you had high blood pressure, if you had this, you had that. It was happening a lot around that same time in the 1970s. But the nutrition in the lower lands of Sardinia, they were getting a lot of Western food come in the 70s. So there still seems to be a small group that is surviving and maybe trying to get back and relive and really, teach the younger generations how to still prepare foods and look after themselves. But in Okinawa, no way. The Okinawans are now, and I think I spoke about the Kaseki, so their birth, deaths, and marriage registry, which potentially Makoto Suzuki accessed, had been rewritten by the occupying Americans at the time, the military, because 93% of their buildings were destroyed and most of the kaseki, their handwritten kaseki, were in their houses and they were also destroyed. So in 1949, the Americans re-established them. And we're talking about a group of people who lost a third of the civilians in World War II, the Battle of Okinawa. Their livelihood was destroyed, their crops were destroyed. They had 100,000 pigs pre-war, and after war there was only 800. So we're talking about people who are starving, again, like in Crete. And can you blame someone if they said that they were born 20 years earlier? Maybe we'll say 10. But interestingly, in Okinawa, suddenly there were a lot of people living to 115. So when Makoto Suzuki was seeing them, they were in their 90s and potentially getting into their hundreds. But we're talking later, suddenly 115, who has this many supercentenarians living? You have to start to question. And when the Japanese government went looking, they found 230 centenarians were missing, but their families were still getting their pensions. So there's a lot of crossover between altering their pensions because of horrific conditions. So I'm not really blaming anyone for doing that. And also people, because they were so poor and they were able to access pensions for a lot longer. So they weren't checking up on these people to see that they were still alive. I guess that's the point. Now Okinawa has been called the most obese and the shortest lifespan because Western food came in the 1940s, 1950s. By 1950, I say Coca-Cola bottling plant was sitting off the coast of Okinawa, and as soon as the American invasion, as soon as America took possession of Okinawa, Coca-Cola moved their bottling plant in. So we're talking about Coca-Cola, we're talking about McDonald's, we're talking about Kentucky Fried Chicken. All of these industries have moved into this space. There's something like 32 military bases still on Okinawa, taking up 25% of its land. We've got a lot of military presence from America and Japan still there, even though America gave it back to Japan in the 1970s. So the American influence and the American food influence is huge and potentially has worked its way into a metabolic dysfunctional group as it has anywhere in the Western world that we're eating this highly processed food. So that is there, and these people have not got that longevity advantage anymore. In Ikaria, the elderly people are dying out. And because so many roads have been put in and tourism has been created, health resorts, people are going there wanting to see how to live to 100. I told you it's a tiny rocky island, and it only sustains 8,000 people to live there when they did the 2007 study. 35,000 goats. They've had to take away areas that these people could traditionally move their animals around and take goats down to the beach and take them up to the rocky areas at different seasons. They can't access those areas anymore. And the people going there want to eat plants. They don't want to eat their traditional foods. They don't want to eat the Christmas hog. They don't want to eat that rendered lard all year that helped these people survive when they weren't fasting. And I truly think that Ikari is becoming, it's losing its ability to be called a blue zone because there aren't any aren't significant numbers of elderly people there anymore. In Nicoya, again, you've got the food industry coming in. You've got regulations about where they can fish, because when you bring a whole lot of people in for tourism, you've got to create coastlines that are stunning that they can visit. You don't want traditional people coming along and fishing there and doing this. So their environment is being restricted by the tourism industry. And the Seventh-day Adventist Church now own a food factory in Costa Rica. So they're providing food which will take the place of flesh, meat, eggs, milk and butter. It's very complicated. And if you think about where the blue zones, the church-owned blue zones, are now running these wellness tourism spots in Thailand and in Costa Rica, in Nicoya, in Ikaria, they're charging huge amounts. You can even go to a blue zone wellness retreat in New York City. But what I don't get is you're trying to go and see where all these people are living longer lives, and you've got Loma Linda in America. So are they living longer lives there? The Adventist health studies have been presented. There's 3 Adventist health studies, and they've cited themselves over and over and over again. And if you listen to Michael Orlick, who's one of the lead investigators, he said it was life expectancy based and disease prevention based. It was never actually age validation. And while there were some people in the original documentary that Dan Buttner presented who were significant or seriously healthy in their 90s, in their working still into their 90s, even they, if you listen to the documentary and go back or listen to other interviews, they talk about eating fish or cheeses and milks. Again, that fine print in the Adventist health studies. You can be vegetarian but still eat those things once a week, but you want to call yourself a vegetarian, you want to call yourself a vegan because that is your identity in this church. And the 2023 Netflix documentary, the people Dan Buttner interviewed were only in their 80s. And I'm not criticizing their age and their health and their wellness, and they had incredible vitality and a great deal of purpose, but they were in their 80s. And we were led to believe this whole thing about the blue zones is how to live to 100.
All right, so the age is sketchy. The diet, we know there's holes there.
Oh, yes, and sorry, the Seventh-day Adventist Church ban pork. Like Judaism and Islam, they ban pork. They consider it unclean. They pretty much ban all meats doctrinally, but in particular shellfish and pork, which is a staple for fasting Greek Orthodox. Sorry, I had forgotten to say that bit, sorry.
No, that's great. And the last piece I was going to throw out is the fact that the Westerners now, with the infrastructure and the momentum behind this Blue Zones brand,
Yes.
is going in and changing the landscape.
Yes.
And ruining it for research and, more importantly, the people living there.
I truly believe that. I am really concerned that we're searching for longevity, and it's becoming, the Blue Zones brand in particular, is becoming a purchasable item. we're trying to buy longevity. We're trying to buy not only what we have been told from this Power 9, the cherry-picked bits out of all of these cultures, but the diet is like Melinda. The cherry-picked diet, we're trying to capture that. We're trying to pay for it. We're trying to move into a place. But this is for people who are wealthy. What about the poor? Okay, they're taking these blue zone city makeovers into whole communities to try and change the landscape, but they're also trying to get rid of meat, which I've spoken about. They tried to get rid of meat out of the restaurants, out of schools, out of groceries. They put them further and further back and highlight the plants. They also want to get other churches on board. This is part of the mission. And if you can get churches talking about it, we're going to jump right back here to 2000. The man who started the Australian Lifestyle Medicine Association, which became the Australasian Society of Lifestyle Medicine, ALMA, Gary Egger, he spoke in 2000 for ILSI, the International Life Sciences Institute, which I talked before was founded by Alex Malaspina, the then vice president of Coca-Cola. So this group was actually food and pharmaceutical industries. It was actually tobacco at the beginning, a whole lot of things. So Gary Egger was talking for ILSI and the World Health Organization. And he presented a paper discussing the way to get rid of unhealthy food in the South Pacific, which is very important to me because this is my neighbor. So in the South Pacific, when he determined what was unhealthy food, he only spoke about fatty meat. Because, of course, again, the South Pacific early in 2000 didn't have a lot of Western food in it. So they wanted to get rid of the fatty meats that were there because they believed that was causing type 2 diabetes. And again, back in 2000, it was minimal, metabolically unhealthy, but they already had Coca-Cola. They already had Coca-Cola cheaper to buy than bottled water in a lot of the South Pacific countries. They already had sanitariums selling a lot of their foods over there. I don't believe he was a Seventh-day Adventist, but he spoke and said, we need to get rid of unhealthy food, and the way to do that is to use the church. Because people come to the church. And the South Pacific peoples are very devoutly religious. They've had a lot of missionary people go and land over the last couple of 100 years and bring religion with them. But when the Adventists moved in, they brought not only education but healthcare. They're entering wedge into these places. And if you consider in the South Pacific that you're going in there, I spoke to someone recently who told me he'd visited a couple of the places a lot, and originally the education from the Seventh-day Adventist Church was trade. They actually helped them learn how to be self-sustaining. But in the last 15 or so years, it's become high-level education. It's become academia, medical, nursing, dietetic, and it's become government. They've trained them to move into these positions of power. And these people are grateful because they may have been poor and having to work really, really hard. And instead now you've got James Marape, and he is the president of Papua New Guinea, the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea. He has said in his opening speech, he now has an opportunity to take his religious beliefs into places he could never do before. That's pretty powerful, Jessie. When I was doing some studies back in 2018, 2019, 7 presidents and prime ministers of South Pacific countries were Seventh-day Adventist. James Marape the year before, did a mission for Christ. But he didn't say the mission for Christ was mission for Seventh-day Adventists version of Christ. And they baptized 300,000 people in Papua New Guinea for the church. And that mission for Christ is coming throughout the South Pacific. They're running it in different countries, and eventually in 2027, I think it's coming to Australia. But you think about that. I spoke at a Nourishing Australia event last year, which is really promoting regenerative agriculture and the concept of animals being so important for soil health, but also how do you replant and how do you culture the land, I guess, to recapture water? How do you make it viable in Australia's climate? It was a fascinating discussion. But I was talking to these guys about climate and climate activism. The Seventh-day Adventist Church have people in the highest level of this climate discussion as well. Because if you think about it, we've talked about their mission being to demonize saturated fats, so it worked to work with groups who wanted to minimize the harms of sugar. That was a great symbiotic relationship. Well, the climate discussion is also similar, because the climate discussion want to demonize animal proteins and fats as well. So we've got key people in this space in the South Pacific working with, and again, I can't remember the name, I'm so sorry, but there's a group that's based in Hawaii and an American group in Hawaii that is liaising with the South Pacific. And they are predominantly Seventh-day Adventist people at a high level being able to have conversations about climate and getting rid of animal proteins and fats. So as the circle just keeps going round and round. It's really fascinating.
If we go back to Ellen G. White, her visions, it's obvious that for her, getting rid of the animal meats was important. But I'm just curious, you've talked about how the Adventists are using this as a wedge to spread the religion, the food piece.
Yes.
But it seems like there is a bit of both, where they actually do have certain principles when it comes to diet and not eating meat. You mentioned the climate piece. How much of it would you say they actually believe these things and want to push that messaging forward versus the religion?
I have listened to many ex-Adventists. I've listened to a lot of Adventist podcasts and conferences, but I've also listened to ex-Adventists, and they've said even when they've left the church, it was very, very hard to reintroduce or to consider animal protein and fat wasn't going to harm them. And most of them have never gone to pork because it's been so indoctrinated to believe that it's an unclean food. Not everybody, and some of them have definitely gone down that pathway saying, I don't believe it anymore, because as we've highlighted in those blue zones, pigs were a way to survive. They didn't eat a lot of pig. They fattened it for the year, they slaughtered it, but that 20 litres of lard of those 5 gallons was able to preserve meat and to use for cooking and to also preserve for soap. And this was a way of survival for a lot of these communities that were isolated. It was nourishment. And if you consider that Loma Linda, that Ellen G. White, so again, her messaging, she says she had over 2,000 visions and dreams from God in her lifetime, that her writing is written by the finger of God, guided by the Holy Spirit, and it barricades the Bible. The church believed she was the spirit of prophecy, and it was elevated to as high a position as any of the other Bible writers. And while some people more recently have tried to disassociate that, she was talking about present truth and she was important for the start of the mission. But if you look at the doctrines, they all lead back to all of her, her world view. And so you can't separate the doctrines. People can't say they are part of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in all honesty without actually having at the back of their mind, the back of their belief system, Ellen G. White's visions and teachings, because that's where they all go back to, even though some of them might be sublime now. But yeah, she had all these visions. But when the church was founded, or the little flock. So again, they moved away from this Millerite movement and they started to study the Bible to see what was happening. And she said that, this idea that Jesus didn't return to earth in 1844 was they had the right day. They just had the wrong event. And that Jesus had moved from his holy place to his most holy place to start this investigated judgment. But some people along the way said, well, if you're following all these other things, if you really look at the First Testament of the Bible, and they were doing a lot of their research and work in that space, we shouldn't be eating pork. And Ellen and James, because they used to write everything down, like everything was, all of their responses were written down. Publishing had started, and that was how they were getting their work and their message out. They were itinerant preachers as well, but the publishing world gave them a big voice. And they wrote, it's published, it's online, that that if pork was going to be prohibited by God, he would give that message to more than just one or two people, these people who were telling them. He would give it to us as well. So they didn't dismiss pork, they didn't dismiss meat. They dismissed meat, as a purity thing, because they were worried that it was stimulating baser passions, as I mentioned before. They worried it was about the temperance movement at the time. This idea that you shouldn't be smoking and drinking, and that it was leading to impure thoughts, impure actions. So it was more along those lines, and they believed meat was a stimulant, like a lion eats meat, and so it's vicious and it's wild and it's heated and it's passionate, and where look at a cow who eats grass. That was I think their belief system. But it was about 7 years before they finally said, Ellen G. White was given this vision from God finally, and when she tried to explain why they'd written that pork was okay 7 years earlier, she said, well, God doesn't want to overwhelm people. He wants to bring information to them when they're ready to learn the next bit. And that wasn't that important, but now it is. And then, so it's called present truth. And she was able to keep bringing present truth. She wrote about wigs causing criminal behaviour and insanity. She wrote about dress reform. She wrote about all sorts of things. She actually had a Seventh-day Adventist dress designed for women, and because women didn't want to wear it, then she had a message from God that it wasn't that, they didn't have to worry about it anymore. But it was written as a doctrine. So it's very confusing. You have to really uncover. And if you're just accepting the church for the values and the belief, and they're teaching now that it's not about masturbation, they're teaching that it's about ethical and climate reasons that we're not eating meat. Ellen G. White said not to eat it, but this is the reason why we don't do it. Then that is a believable message, and I think yes, a lot of people are doing it because they think it's the right thing. But again, it's not that they don't eat it; it's just that they eat less, and what they're eating is probably enough. But I've told you, I've had people contact me and said everyone in their church is sick. Everyone's got metabolic health issues. People have got diabetes because these people aren't affluent. They're not necessarily highly educated. They're not living in Loma Linda in this amazing retirement community that supports their well-being, and they're sick. So they're telling people that they live long. They're telling people it's their diet. But you have to question the diet, and you have to question these claims, especially when Michael Orlick says it's life expectancy. And if you look at America's own demographics, California does not rank in amongst the longest living people.
It's crazy to think how much of what we're doing today in the nutrition world, how much of it ties back to Ellen G. White
I know.
in visions. And that's what we're basing education, books, and our practices in the 21st century.
I know. There was a guy called Joan Sabat, and he wrote, I don't know if I talked about it last time, he wrote The Global Influence of the Seventh-day Adventist Church on Diet. I believe in response to Gary first speaking about my research in 2018. It came out in 2019, and validated everything I've been talking about, because, as I say, everything I've gotten is on the internet. And the reason it's on the internet is because I think in the 1990s, it might have been early 2000s, a group of Seventh-day Adventists believed passionately that all of Ellen G. White's writings should be available to everybody. She said her words were to continue. There was not going to be another prophetess. There was not going to be another person, unlike Mormonism, where they keep getting somebody. Her words were to be till the end of time. And these people complained and said, well, we can't see them. We can only see what the church wants to put out. And they contacted a man in Australia who was very good at hacking. He wasn't an Adventist, but he was friends with them. And he downloaded all of the information, every single bit of access. He was able to get into the vaults of the church. And so these people said, if you don't put it up, we're going to put it up. So the church apparently came after the guy who'd hacked, and it became a court case. There was a whole lot of things, but they had to drop it in the end because Ellen White did say this is the present truth and everyone should know it. So they were able to argue in the end. So they didn't end up putting up the information. The churches had to put it up. But even over time, they keep deleting things, Jessie. They put up what they want to, but there's a link. But if you just read what they've put up, you will still be confused by some of the stuff I'm talking about. You have to go to the source. But every source is there. Every single bit of writing, all of her visions, even the ones that are challenging to the church, they're deep and you have to really go searching, but they're all online. So I've not put up anything that isn't available to me. And it's only available because these guys threatened to put it all up anyway. So if we didn't have the internet, we wouldn't know these things because they've been very careful in what they've published in the last 50 years, particularly. So where was I going?
We were just talking about the influence from late 1800s, early 1900s, Ellen G. White, and what has transferred to our world today through these visions.
Yes, so these visions have come about. So we've got a group of people who've said we want to see what she originally wrote, what was her present truth, how it's evolved. And then, so Joan Sabat has documented a whole lot of things, Counsels for Health, she wrote, and it's a compilation of different things that the church have put together. And he quotes it in this global influence of the Seventh-day Adventist Church on diet. But within it, part of the references is Marika Sorbus. And she wrote about Gary, speaking about my research at Battle Creek, Michigan. And you think, what? How did this... So I am referenced in their paper because I had data that they just decided to use, and it was easier to reference me than to try and find the source document. It was very interesting. But Joan Sabat was also on the US Dietary Guidelines Committee in 2020, and he was determining the caps on saturated fat with a devout belief that we should be having none. He was pushing for zero. So it really does infiltrate at the highest level our belief system, and this demonization of animal proteins and fats is not ancestral. We haven't evolved to eat only plants. It has honestly come, Western vegetarianism has evolved from, I believe, the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Yes, there were some other things leading, the foundational is the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
And to me, that is why I feel this conversation and what you're putting out is so important. So people have the backstory, because I feel people should be able to choose what they want. But as it is now, for their health, for whatever reason, I think everybody needs to be informed and make the best decision for them. But where I have a problem is where people are not freely putting this information out so people can understand the foundation and the religion that it's built on and the money being exchanged.
Yeah.
So I just think it's so important that we're putting this out there so people can at least understand and make a decision informed for themselves.
I agree, Jessie. It's about transparency. And then people can choose. if there's no transparency, which I don't believe there has been, it's this lack of transparency about why they are promoting plants. The lack of transparency about their version of vegan, despite the plate being completely devoid of animal proteins and fats, they include them occasionally to maintain health. And a guy I've been talking about a lot, he was the president of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine in a very high, powerful place. His backstory was that he'd been very unwell, probably eating a lot of processed food, and he had come into the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. He'd heard about this. He had been a devout Adventist all his life, but he was eating the wrong foods. And so he'd come in, learned about a vegan diet, the health reform diet, and he had invested in it and gotten so much healthier, and he was passionate. He promoted sanitarium here in Australia. They have that CHIP program I think I spoke about, where it says that meat, eggs and dairy contribute to the worst possible health outcomes, and we recommend none as our thing, but we want to take people where they're at and work towards that goal. In America, it's called Pivio Health, and it's run through workplaces. Well, this man took it to Cummins University. He took it to a lot of his workplaces that he went to, this CHIP program, and it was devout Adventist, but was being sold as a secular workplace program. Well, he was president of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. He was very high up on the board of the Blue Zones. And I read recently that he'd passed away, and he wasn't very old, wasn't young, but he wasn't very old. And he's still pictured on the board, but he passed away. And so again, it's about being honest. And I'm not saying everybody who eats meat lives to 100. Not everybody lives there, but they're creating an impression that have this incredible health and longevity, but in reality, they're human. And this idea of Ellen G. White's longevity, she believed that if people ate this way, they ate a plant-based diet, the God-appointed diet for man, that antediluvian longevity would come back over generations. We would start to live to 120. We would start to live to 750 years of age. She had this idea, this belief system, if we ate the right way, that we could potentially get incredible longevity. So I think part of that is also coming through. But the Seventh-day Adventist Church's evangelism is just telling everybody. So their salvation, their mission, their goal is to tell everyone. Not everyone has to convert. In fact, there's only 144,000 people in Ellen's original writings that will be translated. It's not very many, Jessie. So this idea of evangelism is just purely to tell people, because then people are allowed to have a choice as to whether they choose to adopt it or they don't. They just have to tell everybody. So they've got a really big focus on is it called the 2030 window or something? I don't know. Getting into China and Russia and places that do not accept Western cultures, and the only way they can get in there is with health or with food.
Another thing I want to point out while we're on this tangent is that there is a lot of trust that people have in government, in dietitians, in people that are making these decisions and telling people what they should be eating. And with the tentacles of the Adventists running through everything, people just don't have the time to do the research like you and I, and to actually see all the different angles and see some of the wool pulled over our eyes. So I feel for those people. And also public schools, jails, different people where guidelines are going to trickle down and people aren't necessarily going to be able to make decisions for themselves on what they're going to eat.
Absolutely. I think I told you the hospital food guidelines are shocking, and again, align with health star ratings, align with public health messaging. I know you guys have moved into potentially considering that saturated fat isn't bad. I don't know that we'll get here. I don't know that we'll get there in Australia just yet, because there's too much investment. And in our dietary guidelines, I'm not sure we're going to get there. But if you consider at the highest level of influence, I believe, in the US government, so your Senate chaplain, Barry Black, has admitted he's a devout Seventh-day Adventist and he eats a vegetarian diet. He's been in that position for over 20 years, talking to the top people in government in America, to their families, to big groups of people as an authoritative voice. But I uncovered an interview that he did with a Seventh-day Adventist magazine when he was the chaplain in the Navy. And he stated that he had the most amazing opportunity. He could run a sermon on a Saturday to if he was out on tour, say for a 2 or 3 month tour, he would run sermons on Saturday and then he would also do them on Sunday. And when he did them on Sunday, he tried to make it really interesting, and he tried to get the naval officers to think, why are you doing that? Why do you promote this in your religion? Why do you do that? And he stated that he would baptize hundreds of US Navy personnel on these tours. In this document. And now he's been Senate chaplain for, I say, well over 20 years. That is, Bill Clinton went vegan. You look at the doctors who've come in. Devout Seventh-day Adventist doctors have been US president doctors. And this messaging, I say, it gets to the highest level, and then it's subliminal. Then you start to think. Michelle Obama was talking about healthy eating, and it was plants. Where do they get this messaging? Just an observation.
Well, Belinda, you're somebody that has pulled back the curtains, looked at the blue zones from all different angles.
Yeah.
What can we hang our hat on in your mind that you've learned from your research that is valid, that these people are doing to increase their lifespan?
I think, to me, the most important thing is a lot of the pillars that the Adventist Church talk about is a lot of that Power 9 roadmap. But it has to be real, and you have to make it work in your community, in your family, in your situation. And can we get back to creating and sourcing foods locally and seasonally? Can we think about that? And it takes time, Jessie. In Tassie, Gary and I are very, very lucky. We live in this beautiful community that has a lot of local seasonal resources. We don't have a lot of predators. We don't have foxes or wolves or anything to attack a lot of the animals on this island. The amount of chemical inputs are less, and where we have an opportunity to eat eggs. We have our own chickens, but in Tasmania we have opportunity to eat eggs from chickens that free range in the mountains. It's not high mountains, we don't have lots of snow, but they're in the mountains just walking around, eating insects and doing all these things. So we are lucky compared to, say, somewhere like New York City, where there's a lot of high-rise, there's a lot of people living in a small area, there's not a lot of options to cook your own meals in the same way as we have here. But it's finding places that potentially are doing those things. They're using animal proteins and fats. They're working out how to preserve foods, and they're not using seed oils. I think that's one of the big things. If you can start to decrease refined sugar, if you can pull away from the refined, processed seed oils, and you can try to eat nourishing food that we've evolved to eat. Try and get away from as much processed food as possible, understanding that there's moral gymnastics in whatever we do. In winter, Gary and I will buy a tin of tomatoes if we need them, but they're not highly processed. So again, it's not about making expectations for people that they can't achieve. It's about doing the best you can with what you have to offer, I guess.
As we close here, somebody to this point who has been highly invested in Blue Zones, reading the books, eating the meals, maybe going on a retreat, and they're feeling like their foundation is now rocked hearing this new information, what would you say to them?
I'm sorry, but it's the truth. It's very confronting. It's very hard. And I think I mentioned that in my last talk with you, that uncovering these things, actually, it confronted me emotionally, but it confronted a lot of my values, a lot of my beliefs, my education. And I think this is where we need to keep looking. And as you say, you and I research ourselves to find a lot of these things. You speak to the most amazing people, and I've listened to a number of your interviews and learn from those as well. But it does rock your world. And I have the Australasian Society of Lifestyle Medicine is seriously confronted by my research, by my findings, and they want me to be quiet. But when people are being harmed, when I believe the information isn't being transparent, I can't stop talking, Jessie, just because it's just in me. I just go, this isn't fair. And the more people we have around us, the more people we can look to for support, the bigger the community we can create in this space, things start to change. As Gary said, low-carb beer, there's about 8 different types of low-carb beer you can get here in Australia now. The market changes when people push for change. So Harvey Wiley was a chemist and working on the Poison Squad back in the early 1900s, and his big mission was to get cocaine out of Coca-Cola, caffeine and cocaine. And he tried everything, and it didn't matter where he was blocked, whether it was upper house, lower house, or whatever you call it, in American politics. He just kept being blocked at different levels, even though he'd get some support at one level, it just couldn't get through. And he threw his hands up in the end, and he went and worked for a women's magazine. This is a highly qualified professional food chemist. And he just said, I need to go to the people. And so he wrote to the women, to the mothers who were purchasing the food. And he explained to them what was in this product, what was in other products that were being hidden at the time. And I believe, and again, the number, we'll say 20,000, but it could have been more, women marched on Congress to demand that Coca-Cola get rid of caffeine and cocaine. They reduced it because of public pressure, not because of Congress. So this is where I think we do have an opportunity to make a difference.
Well, the work you're doing is so critical, and it is making such a difference. So I want to thank you for taking the time to do this research, compile it in a way where we can all understand what's happening behind the scenes. It's brave work. It's important work. I thank you, Belinda.
Thank you so much, Jessie. And I really appreciate the opportunity to have 2 sessions to really be able to give such a broad conversation, because if you hear sound bites, it's very hard to believe. So thank you so much.
Well, I think what we've done here, at least I hope, and I feel like we have, is to share the alternative narrative.
Yes.
And get people thinking, hopefully get people doing their own research, and get people to not blindly trust the authority, not to rebel for the sake of rebelling,
No.
but to understand that there's oftentimes more than one story.
Yes.
And the one you're sharing here is so important. So thank you again.
Much appreciated. Thanks, Jesse.
Thank you for watching. Stick around here for this other great interview. You don't want to miss it. I'll see you over there.
This isn't reality. This is marketing a mythical longevity pill. Dan Buettner trademarked Blue Zones in 2005. In 2020, the Seventh-day Adventist Church bought the Blue Zones franchise from Dan Buettner.